In the conducting interpretive considerations portion of this video, I want to talk about the theme and each successive variation in order. Regarding the theme, the tempo is marked con moto quarter equals 96, yet many take tempos that are much slower than that. I suggest that conductors try to stay within 4 to 8 beats of this tempo, just to try to keep things moving and to kind of stick with what John Barnes Chance is suggesting. I might also suggest that the semplice marking be observed, that we not do too much with regard to shape in this section. And the final bar of the theme, the timpani has a note that is struck, and on occasion I've heard bands the timpanist will play this as a roll. I'm going to suggest to you that this should just simply be a strike. The fermata does not mean that you should be writing as a roll. The vivace, variation 1. Strive for ensemble clarity in this section. Avoid overdoing the forte dynamic and the accents that are printed a little bit later in the variation. At the conclusion of the variation, there is a section where there are 4.5 beats of rest, and I would suggest that perhaps you outline carefully a little bit those beats, or not conduct at all, and then simply giving a strong prep beat on count 2 for the entrance on count 3. So something like this. Or no conducting at all. Something that is going to be reflective of that silence. Moving to variation 2. Variation 2 begins with a mezzo forte chord for 2 bars, and then piano chords for 2 bars. And again, these toggle back and forth between a couple of minor 7th chords, A flat minor 7th and an E flat minor 7th. So just be aware then that we have this mezzo forte introduction, then piano, and then the oboe comes after that. It makes room dynamically for the oboe to make that entrance without any balance issues. Also common in this variation is the misplaying of the triplet 2/8 figure. Very often the triplet will become compressed, being some semblance of almost 2/16 and an eighth. And I would encourage you to just elongate those triplets so that they're exactly correct in each time that that rhythm occurs. Okay, variation 3, the Allegro con brio. He gives a tempo marking of 144. I would suggest that we try to be somewhere in that neighborhood. While the marking dynamically is fortissimo, I usually back this off a little bit, try to keep my gestures nice and crisp. Bump, 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 that kind of thing. And then what that does is it reserves some opportunity for you to use a little bit bigger gestures to indicate the rise and fall, the crescendo and diminuendo that we have in the horns just a few bars into this. At the trumpet entrance, I tend to really make a big deal about the leggero marking. And in some of the earlier printings, the parts, the leggero marking, and maybe even in the score, leggero is missing. So make sure that you are playing with a light, upward impulse kind of style. And then those that are simply playing the interruptive notes, the briam in the woodwinds and snare drum, that you can make a deal of those gesturally. Brum, diddle-a-dum, diddle-a-dum, diddle-a-diddle-a-diddle-a-dum, diddle-a-diddle-a-diddle-a-dum, diddle-a-dum, briam, briam, briam. So you can make a big deal of those particular gestures. Everything else I would use smaller gestures so that those hits kind of come at, act a little bit as being interruptive. At 140, make sure that you're checking all accidentals in the trombones, as that can be sometimes an issue with all those sharps, especially the A sharps in the second trombone. And try not to compress the 3/8 figure. Bom, biddle-a-dum, diddle-a-dum. For some reason in this section, the woodwinds like to compress those, so make sure that those are full USDA grade A eighth notes. Okay, as we move to the end of this variation, looking at the transition at 166. I would encourage you to think about 166 as in groups of measures. And the first group is a group of 3 measures that begins with the snare drum forte piano crescendo over the course of 3 bars. Then the next one should be a 4-bar group, which begins with the gong strike. So snare drum, 2, 3, gong. And then in the 4th bar of that group, the snare drum crescendos out of the texture. So a 3-bar group, a 4-bar group that begins with gong and ends with the snare drum crescendo. Then we have the snare drum solo. That is a 4-bar segment. And then, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we have 2 3-bar segments beginning with the timpani. This first 3-bar segment, I suggest you remain in 2, bum, da-da-ga, 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 but the next 3-bar segment we conduct as a macro beat, dum, da-da-ga, 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 dum, which leads, it actually preempts the 3-2 by 1 full bar and helps make that metric modulation nice and clean.